Thank you very much. I'm going to, actually, I'd probably do just as well. I've got a strong voice, so if you can't hear me, I'll get to the microphone, and otherwise I'll just talk. I'm going to have you correct one or two things. Your pre-lecture test, which should say medicine before statehood, not medicine in territorial times. That's just the last piece of it, and so I'm going to talk about something a little bit more. So it's medicine before statehood. And your question number 3, which is a little bit hard to read, it should read, how might patients' belief in traditional concepts of illness, wellness, and disease pertain to current medical practice? So it's maybe a little bit easier, hopefully, to be able to do this. Medicine before statehood, of course, is roughly 12,000 years. I have 30 minutes to do this, so I'm going to probably talk about 4,000 years for each 10 minutes. And hopefully that will do reasonably well. Actually, fortunately, most of this, of course, is not known. The earliest humans in Arizona were probably the Sandia culture, which was focused in New Mexico, which is estimated at about 25,000 BC. The Ice Age comes in between about 18 to 12,000. We then get the Folsom culture, which is 25 to 10,000 years, which then advances to several more advanced cultures, which are the Anasazi, the Cochise, and the Hohokam cultures. And this sounds like, wouldn't have any pertinence because there's no way for us to know, but keep listening. How did Paleolithic man decide which plants were medicinal? And there's several anthropologic theories on this. One is starvation. If you're starving, you're going to eat anything you can find. And if you don't die, maybe it's okay. And if you don't die and your gouty foot stops hurting, maybe it's a good thing and you realize that it's a medicinal plant. The second theory, and there's no way of testing these, of course, is that they followed the animals. Paleolithic man, all of our earliest ancestors, had to be intensely good observers, of what was going on around them, and they would follow the animals. They would look at what the deer and the bear and the rabbits and everyone else ate and figure out sort of what could be reasonable, and they would stay away from other things with that. So how can we possibly know what were medicinal at plants being used or what medicine consisted of at the time? And the answer is coprolites. Now I have to explain to you the difference between coprolites and paleofeces. Coprolites is fossilized fecal material, and they have some from humans. Paleofeces is just old poop, right? Coprolites, they have found that date back well over 1,000 BC to several thousand, to 4, 5, 6, 7,000. And in this area, they have found some that are intriguing, because they have found the stems and the pollen from ephedra, which is Mormon tea, and they've also found it from one of these plants that you will recognize very well, which is Larea or Eliondia, which is creosote tea, creosote bush. And if you ever go into Arizona in the rain, you see, I was raised in Arizona and I thought the rain smelled wonderful everywhere until I went to Baltimore and found out it didn't. But they have found actually evidence of this, and since you figure it's not that tasty and not that good to eat, probably they were being used as medicinal plants long before there is any kind of history that's available that we could be able to tell. There are 100 or so medicinal plants listed, and these are just that Margarita Kay did. Dr. Kay did intensive research on this. Can't hear? If I get away? Okay. Dr. Margarita Kay did intensive research on the medicinal plants of the Southwest, going all the way back, and found some fascinating things. The 100 most common she gives in this book, and there are basically thousands of others that are there. The Tohono and Akimel Autumn concept of disease, which would be what we would be talking about in this area, is rather unique among any cultures, and that is they divided disease into staying sickness and wandering sickness. And that is still one of the Tohono Autumn and Akimel Autumn beliefs. Staying sickness is one that stays with you. That would be diseases such as heart disease and diabetes, and wandering sickness, of course, wanders from person to person. Actually, you can understand the logic of it, and that would be measles, tuberculosis, and virtually any of the other diseases that were terrible, actually, in terms of contagion and all of the epidemics. And that's going to be one of the answers to this. What killed most of the people up until, most recently in Arizona history, it was infectious disease, especially epidemics. Aztec medicine, now the Aztec Empire, I have to explain, is a lot further south. But the Aztec Empire was related in the extent that we're not part of the Aztec Empire in the southwestern area here, but they are related both linguistically, historically, and by trade routes. The people in this area, with two exceptions, all spoke a Uto-Aztecan language. They were related culturally and linguistically and probably genetically in the past. Aztec medicine was fatalistic. Most illness was considered a punishment from the gods. But they had extensive physical and basically surgical knowledge and had an amazing amount of use of herbs. They had to have good physical and surgical knowledge, or they wouldn't have been able to remove people's hearts in 15 seconds, which they apparently did when they were doing sacrifices. There is a fabulous quote from Cortez shortly after he comes to Mexico, sending back to the King of Spain saying, "Don't send any doctors, they've got better ones here." This is from the purveyor of Western medicine at the time, Cortez. He also said there is a whole street in Tenochtitlan, later Mexico City, which is devoted entirely to pharmacopoeias, to pharmacies and the use of herbal medicines. Montezuma had something that no one has had, an experimental herb garden that he gathered medicinal plants from all over the Aztec Empire and as far as he could reach. They said there was nothing like it in all of Europe. He had this huge garden of medicinal plants that they would try out and try for various things. And Dr. Margarita Kay also has listed herbal remedies for all external conditions such as boils, bruises, burns, canker sores, fractures, hemorrhoids, herpes, poisonous bites and stings and wounds. And one of the early priests in this area in the 1700s is writing that he really didn't pay too much attention to this until he had one of the people that was taking him when he was on his rounds as a missionary was one of the Indians or Mexicans, Spaniards, who was badly injured when he's got his leg caught under a wagon wheel. And the thing was enormously swollen, and they thought there's a good chance that he was going to lose his limb or his life. And the Indians said, no problem, and they took some ocotillo branches, which he misspelled as jocotillo, and mashed all of this up, boiled it up, put a poultice on the leg, and the next day it was markedly better, and by 2 days he was well. So Pfefferkorn decided, well, maybe there is something to this. There's also aloe and something called lizard's tail, and there's a wonderful quote that she had about the use of all of the cacti for various kinds of external and internal conditions. Stomach and intestines, urinary system, heart problems, and circulation, and diabetes. However, Dr. Kay, writing in the 1990s, reports that there is no treatment that comes for diabetes from plants of the American Southwest, but that was before we got Gila monster spit, otherwise known as Bayetta. So we do get certain things from this. Fevers and arthritis, absolutely, and you certainly can find, and what I have here is a listing of some of the other foods that and herbs that were used. Interestingly, they found also that there was a huge amount of basic experimentation. They couldn't find it except from the record of seeing what people used. And what she did in finding different tribes was they weren't unique to that tribe. They would find people living in one valley who were one tribe or one people, and people living in the next valley, maybe 5 miles distant, would use an entirely different group of plants depending upon what it was there. It sounded like it was a significant amount of experimentation. The exception for this, and they would use that if you had 2 or 3 different tribes inhabiting the same area, very often, regardless of their tribal ethnicity or background, they would use the same kinds of plants. There was a lot of cross-cultural kinds of things that were going on with there. The exception were the Apaches and the Navajo, who were not Uto-Aztecan, and their herbal remedies and belief systems came from further north where they ultimately came from. The Apaches and the Navajo were further north and further east ultimately in their origins. In summary, the southwestern desert and mountains are very rich in ethnobotany, and they're still used frequently today. And if you don't think that they're there, try talking to some of your patients, and when they trust you enough, they'll let you know. Then we get to the Spanish colonial period. So I'm taking you basically up to about now 1519 with Cortez's conquest of Mexico, which was 1519 to 1521. Cortez now brings the Western concepts of medicine with him. The Western concept, of course, you can fall asleep now if you've already heard this when I gave it to you a year ago, which is the humoral theory of medicine. It is inherited from the ancient Greeks. It is still absolutely believed up until the 19th century. It's starting to break down a little bit, but the whole concept is earth, air, fire, and water, which is the 4 elements of nature, are reflected in the 4 humors of the human body, which is black bile, yellow bile, blood, and phlegm. We even have words that come from this because if you are sick, even if you're wounded, what that means is that these are out of balance, and the whole purpose is to pull you back into balance from dyskrasis, dyscrasia, in which we still use the term, into krasis, or which is Greek for balance. So some of this makes perfect sense, of course. If you have a disease characterized by hot and dry, like a high fever, you treat it with cool and wet. Equally, if you have a cold and a bad runny nose, which is like cool and wet, then you treat it with something which tends to dry things up. So there's a certain amount of sense to it. It was enormously well believed. You can read in Shakespeare, of course, in Taming of the Shrew, where Petruchio reprimands his cook for feeding him and Katerina a food which is choleric, which means is high in choleric or fire elements, because they were both choleric people. He said, "This is not what you should be feeding us." It is an absolute belief that was still inhabited absolutely in Spain in this time and in most of the West. It dates from Hippocrates, we think. But those of you familiar with Ayurvedic medicine, Hippocrates dates from 400 BC. Ayurvedic concepts go back to at least 600 BC and probably a lot further. And I think that if you look at it closely, there's an enormous amount of similarity. And it may well be that the Greeks and Hippocrates got it through the Egyptians, who got it from the Indians, because it goes back actually far further than that. Ayurvedic medicine still contains the idea of keeping things back into balance. Cortez, at the time he conquers Mexico, has an urgent request to send more medicinal plants for the benefit and prosperity of the people. Interestingly enough, though, contrast the approach that Cortez has and that the Spanish has when they conquered this, and granted they were very brutal in their conquest of Mexico, but they were fascinated and very interested in the medicinal use of plants by the peoples that were there. That, as compared with Northern Europeans, which tended to be relatively dismissive of Indian treatments as well as Indian beliefs, and they would acknowledge some of them, but they frequently would not have that much interest. The Spanish, on the other hand, even from the time of Columbus, who said that he heartily regretted that he had not had a chance to send samples back of all of the trees and herbs and everything that he found in the New World, writing in about 1493. The Spanish avidly sought to learn of their medicinal herbs, and even though they were a conquered people, they would try to seek them out. The 2 giants in this area were writing, and this has pertinence later, so bear with me, were Bernardino de Sahagún, who writes a 12-volume series in the mid-1500s about things that had to do with plants and herbs and everything about Nueva España, New Spain or Mexico. And Sahagún, they had actually had some of the nobles of the Nahuatl or the Aztec Empire come to Spain, and he goes back with them and in the process learns Nahuatl language so that he is absolutely fluent in it. He is probably the most profound anthropologist before this, long before anthropology became a discipline. He would go and seek out the older medicine men, the older healers of the Nahuatl empire and talk to them about the medicines that they used and do this as much as possible. But he had to be very careful about what he did. That is, he had to toe a fine line. The priests tended to be much more on the side of the native people, whom they regarded as people that they were to save for Christianity. Whereas the main part of the Spanish Empire was much more interested in the amount of gold that they could get. And ultimately, the priests are being forced out. He stood danger politically if he appeared to be too much on the side of the Indians, that he'd fall foul of the Inquisition, which is going on, and they would accuse him of heresy because he was getting too much of the plants in there or the belief system in there. So perhaps for that reason, he included nothing about their belief about appeasing the gods and other kinds of things. So we lose a good part of the pharmacopoeia of early Mexico with that. His successor was Francisco Hernandez, who was the personal physician of Philip II, who was the successor of the Emperor Charles I, who was the one at the time of Cortez. And Philip II, of course, is the Spanish Armada. But Philip earlier had sent this man, who is his personal physician, and he wrote a 6-volume series about 3,000 plants. He wrote it totally in Nahuatl. He wrote it totally, in other words, in the Aztec language. Spain suppressed it. They didn't want the knowledge to get out. And he, again, had to be very careful about this. Why did they have to be so careful about this? Partly because it was politically incorrect to be on the side of the Indians. And there was an increasing kind of thing where they had to toe a very careful line. The other is that they were both conversos. They were forcibly converted from being Jews to both Sahagún and Hernandez were. And so they were treading on thin ice anyway, because it would be very easy for someone to accuse them of heresy or being not good Catholics. Very interestingly enough, Spain lost most of its intelligentsia just about the very same day, like one day before Columbus, who probably also was Jewish. It's one of these wonderful things of history, but all of these were forcibly converted, and the day before, those who refused were forcibly expelled from Spain. It's 1492. They lost most of their doctors, most of their intelligentsia at that time, because most of the physicians in Spain were Jews. So Sahagún and Francisco Hernandez both had to be rather careful about doing this. His work on this incredible pharmacopoeia about the herbal remedies was suppressed for 100 years, and it also was sort of limited by his prejudices. Again, you believe in the herbal theory of medicine. So what do you do with this kind of thing when something that is clearly hot and dry and you're using it to treat a condition which is hot and dry? Well, it doesn't make any sense. But he was good enough to write it down. He says, this doesn't make any sense, but this is what they do. So it was very good. It was lost for a long time. Finally, copies were found, and they've redone it now. But one of the people who found it was another priest whose name was Jimenez, who in the mid-1600s gets a hold of a copy, doesn't attribute it to anyone, and publishes it he says, for people where there are no doctors and no pharmacies. This becomes the basis. Now, who does he publish it for? It has to be educated people, so it goes to the priests. The priests then have this basic pharmacopoeia that they then pass to common people, and a lot of the beliefs that come north from Mexico into southern Arizona are based upon this ancient belief, and they're still with us today, and you can find a lot of the uses of medicines from this time. Gradually, they were mostly concerned, the Spanish were, about conquering the Aztec Empire. They really didn't go into this area that much because they didn't see much use of the northern area. It was full of savages and it was dry, barren desert. So they didn't do too much, but this was part of the trade route. So gradually they started expanding into here. And especially after Cabeza de Vaca comes back and says that there's 7 cities of gold, that sort of sparked their interest. That was 1536. So then you have Fray Marcos de Niza and you have Francisco Vázquez de Coronado in 1540 to 42. Goes all the way to the Grand Canyon. And by about 1600, we're up to about the current border. Now I got to talk to you about disease. With Cortez, of course, comes all of Western man's diseases. In Cortez's 1519, 1520, smallpox breaks out in Veracruz, and it quickly spread to Tenochtitlan, the capital, and up the coast, and an estimated 1/2 of the population sooner or later died within the first 10, 15, 20 years of Spanish occupation. Regularly thereafter, it continued about every 8 to 10 years. There would be a smallpox outbreak all the way up to 1751. They have one reported in Arizona, and you'd be happy to know that in 1870, some 30 people died of smallpox in Tucson. This is in spite of the fact that we now have vaccination. It was not universal, and people could still die of it. Measles, 1531 was the first measles epidemic, 1595 to 96, 1690, and one in 1693 that was especially devastating. Roughly 1/3 of the population, the indigenous population of Sinaloa and Sonora, died as a result of that. In 1545 and subsequently in 1575, there was an odd plague called Matlazahuatl, M-A-T-L-A-Z-A-U-A. Matlazahuatl, I'll spell it later. Anyway, what's going on with this? This is very strange because this is a disease that essentially only affects the Indian population, which says to me that it must have been brought by the Spanish because they weren't affected by it, but the Indians were, and it was devastating. 800,000 listed as killed in 1545 in the Aztec Empire in what was now Mexico, Nueva España. 1575, one of the priests is estimating up to 2 million. These may be wildly exaggerated, but you get the idea that huge decimation was going on. No Spanish deaths. And I suspect that this is one cause of the revolts, all of these repeated epidemics, because with the Spanish who are coming, trying to convert the Indians, and the Indians in this area, by the way, were very much interested in what the Spanish had. They had no particular desire to be against them because the Spanish had things they wanted. They had tools, they had metallurgy, they had a lot of things that the Indians found useful. But along with that, along with the rigidity of some of the priests and bad treatment that occurred, sometimes these epidemics would break out and the poor Indians would look at this thinking the gods were angry at them, and because they would get these terrible epidemics. In some instances, they would go into an area and all the Indians would run away. In others, there were major rebellions. The last one of the Pima Indians was 1698 to about 1700 in this area. There were others about 1752 or 3, which is why Tubac was founded, but that's a later on one that was going on. So in the Southwest, they had Matlazahuatl in 1736, reported as an epidemic in the Presidios down in this area. Smallpox in 1737, measles in 1744 and 49. In the 1790s, the Presidio records said that there was one year where roughly 1/3 of the children under 5 or 8 died of measles. Still, there was a Jesuit that wrote in the late 1600s, the most deadly epidemic in Sonora has been the arrow of the Seri Indians and the lance of the Apache Indians. So they were looking more toward that. However, wounds were treated in the Aztec Empire by cleaning it very well and filling it with peyote root, which means it may not have cured, but you may not have cared. Pfefferkorn in the late 1700s is writing that no doctor or surgeon, Pfefferkorn, his name was Ignaz Pfefferkorn, and he was one of the early Spanish priests. Doesn't sound very Spanish, does it? There was an earlier Spanish priest whose name was Johann Steinmeier, and he changed his name to Juan de Estemeyer or something like this. He changed it to try to, so he sounds more Spanish and is more acceptable. Anyway, Pfefferkorn is saying no doctor or surgeon in Sonora to open the, there is no doctor or surgeon in Sonora to open the vein of a very sick person, but little reason to complain. There are herbs which when boiled and taken internally, cure dangerous inflammatory fevers without a waste of blood. So there's starting to be a little bit of the breakdown of this idea because, again, from the time of the American Revolution, if you remember the last time I bored you with this, everyone believes in the humoral theory. And even if you were injured, if you'd been shot and you weren't bleeding enough, they'd bleed you because it's good for everything. And that's partly because they believe that the blood element is in everything, and therefore it's always a good idea to bleed people. How much blood would you remove? Well, roughly about this amount, and I can demonstrate, but I think you've seen me do this before. And roughly you'd take about a pint, and you'd do another pint the next day, and you'd do another pint the next day, until and you give them, and the other methods for treating to pull things back into balance in humoral theory were that you would either purge them, give them a cathartic, or give them an emetic. And so they used a lot of ipecac, and they used a lot of something that you find even in the Americans, in American forts. They would send off for jalap. What's jalap? It's from the province of Jalapa in Mexico, and from where we get the jalapenos, so you can get an idea of what this was used for. It was very effective for doing this. They also used a great deal of castor oil, so that everyone needed to be purged, of course, in this time. How many remember their parents telling them that they had to be purged every spring? Yes. So this is later on when they said that when we get up to the 19th century and there is a significant improvement in the amount of medical knowledge, and they said that Virchow, with the studies on cellular anatomy, was the death knell of the humoral theory. Don't believe it. It still existed into the 1900s very easily on this. Pfefferkorn was saying that you could do this, and there was one of the other priests that wrote, older Spanish women of the province constitute the College of Physicians of Sonora, which is a good statement on doing this. 1768, there is founded a medical school in Mexico City by the king, Carlos III, who then says there decrees that medicine and surgery, which remember were totally separate up until that time and just now starting to get together, there was no distinction. He said there wasn't to be any distinctions. And what do you do where there is no doctor? We get into the 1800s and the presidial system here, there's no doctors. The closest is going to be down in Arizpe in Sonora. But what happens now is that they'll take a soldier that they think has the skill for it, and they send him down there to learn surgery. And they did that. There was one that was sent in about 1810 to 15 to learn surgery from the Presidio of Tucson. There is, remember what is going on also scientifically by this time, because the humoral theory is pertinent and is absolutely, and is prevailing in spite of the fact that we now have Harvey in the circulation of blood. We have an increasing knowledge of anatomy. We have Morgagni and pathologic anatomy. We have James Lind and the understanding, we don't understand why, but we understand that citrus can get rid of scurvy. We have variolation, which ultimately becomes vaccination. Still, the humoral theory held, but it was beginning to start to break down at least a little bit. That didn't prevent George Washington from being bled to death, of course, and the current feeling of people is that he probably died of epiglottitis but he was weakened by progressive bleeding that was done, that weakened him to the point where he did succumb to it. Might not have survived anyway because they had nothing in the way of antibiotics. The only antibiotic we had is, of course, quinine. Right, and quinine was used for malaria, and they did understand what that was, not why quinine helped it, but they'd use it for everything. My father contracted typhoid fever in 1887, and he was treated with quinine, and you're supposed to give it until your ears ring, so his ears rang the rest of his life on this. That was how people were treated. At the time, that was the only one that they had. We get to the Mexican period with the independence of Mexico in 1820 to 1848 to 54. That's the end of the Mexican cession, at the end of the Mexican-American War, 1845 to 48, and then the Gadsden Purchase, where we are now at 1854. Mexico, however, was unable to maintain the Presidios. They declined with more and more Apache raids, although some of the Apaches stayed and actually bravely defended the Presidios. They would have been part of the Presidial system. I think that was, they were settled in areas of Tucson, which was the area of the Apaches Manzos, the peaceful Apaches or pacified Apaches. And I think that's the origin of Barrio Manza, where we have today. It corresponded, however, with major advances because now anatomy is pretty well understood. Physiology is understood with von Helmholtz and Virchow, with the cellular basis of anatomy. Claude Bernard in the scientific method. But in Arizona, we still had unnamed epidemics in 1860, 1816 that took 25 children in Tucson. 1849 to 51, there was a cholera epidemic that killed 1,000 people in the Altar Valley and a quarter of the population of Tucson. This is just 150 years ago, and it didn't really make any significant difference. Medicine in the time of the 15, 16, 1700s mostly was an apprenticeship program. It's a cottage industry. You would learn medicine by going and apprenticing yourself to another physician, and when you had learned all of his prejudices or he got tired of you, he'd throw you out and you hung up a shingle and you're a doctor. Not much in the basis. Now, it varied enormously, of course, with what you would learn and how good there was. There were medical schools started in what is now the United States. Medical College in Philadelphia from the late, I think about 1768 also, that started, but much of this was done. You still learned a lot of emeral theory. By the 1800s, where we are now, in the United States, there are medical colleges being founded. Medicine was learned, you just go in and it was a 13-week program for 3 semesters each. And some of them were very good, attached to medical schools like Yale and Harvard, and some were very bad, of course, on doing this. The first Anglo-Americans coming into this area where we are now were trappers and adventurers. There were some doctors among them. There was a Dr. Gregg, there was a Dr. Robinson with Zebulon Pike in 1807. And there's one that I really want to tell you about whose name was John Marsh. John Marsh in 1836 makes his way from Santa Fe, going through Arizona, somehow isn't picked up by the Spanish. He gets all the way to California, where he declares himself to be a doctor, and he hangs up a shingle. And the Mexicans actually in California were rather, better than other people are. They wanted to see his credentials. Well, it turns out Marsh said that he had his degree from Harvard and he had his bachelor's degree and it's all in Latin. And he said later that he always intended to study medicine. He just never quite got around to it. But that didn't stop him. So what he decides to do is he hangs out his shingle, and the Mexican authorities say, "What are your credentials?" He said, "Here it is, here's my diploma." It's all in Latin. They can't read it. It's from Harvard. So they send it to the priest. The priest couldn't read it either. So they said, "Okay, he must be a doctor." So they took his word for it. Since if he speaks Latin or if he has this degree in Latin, he's got to be a doctor. So he got by with it, and he started practicing in California. For much of the 19th century, there were no formal doctors in Arizona that stayed. A lot wandered through and went back. With the Mexican-American War, we get the Mormon Battalion coming through, which is another fascinating thing. They were warned, they were told, remember the theory, or what you've heard is Brigham Young promised them that no one would die if they would go and do this. Well, it's not quite what Brigham Young said. What he said is, none of you will be killed in battle. And they did have a number of losses. He warned them also, don't drink the water. He said, don't do the medicinals that they give you. But in other words, just use your own herbs and everything. Brigham Young was pretty far-sighted on this, because what the doctors were going to treat him with was mercury. And if they came up with anything, they're going to be treated with mercury. So at least 2 of them died, and their fellows were absolutely sure that it was because they were treated with high doses of mercury by the doctor, whose name was George Sanderson. That was probably helped along because some of them thought they heard him say, "I'm going to send as many of them to hell as I can." It's a little beyond what medicine is supposed to be, I think. Actually, that's probably an apocryphal story, and probably because they found his diaries later, he probably didn't do that, and he probably was trying to do his best for them. The territorial period comes from when in this area, because we become part of the United States in 1854. The main things that are happening, of course, is right before the Civil War. I'm going to give you some quotes from that as well. I need to say also that we were part of the territory of the United States from 1854, except for a 2-month period in 1862 when we were part of the Confederacy. And that's when Sherrod Hunter's Arizona Rangers came to this area, and they lasted 2 months before the Union Army drove them out. I don't think they had any doctors with them. The first physicians likely to have been in this area were military surgeons, and it absolutely was true that the later population of physicians in Arizona were all contract surgeons with the Union Army, who then came through, decided they liked it, and stayed. Quality of medicine during the Civil War. This is a quote that I think is really pretty good. The unfortunate Civil War soldier, whether he came from the North or from the South, not only got into the Army just when the killing power of weapons was being brought to a brand new peak of efficiency, he enlisted in the closing years of an era when the science of medicine was woefully, incredibly imperfect, so he got the worst of it in 2 ways. When he fought, he was likely to be hurt pretty badly. When he stayed in camp, he lived under conditions that were likely to make him sick. And in either case, he had almost no chance to get the kind of medical treatment which a generation or 2 later would be routine. Both the federal and Confederate governments did their best to provide proper medical care for their soldiers, but even their best wasn't very good. It was nobody's fault. There was just no such thing as good medical care in that age, at least by what is understood now as good medical care. It is fascinating. This was a very deadly war in a number of reasons. One is it was the first war where both sides were using predominantly rifles rather than muskets. They're much more deadly at a much greater range, and both sides were using mini balls, which would expand enormously when they would hit tissue. And one of the other things that had to be understood is if you got a hit anywhere in the head or torso, it likely would have been very quickly fatal. So the only wounds that they saw were people, and plus the fact that they very quickly learned not to stand. Remember that what they did before, they would stand and fire in volleys, and everyone would sort of stand shoulder to shoulder and shoot at the group on the other end of the field. They learned not to do that because everyone died when they did this now. Whereas before with muskets, where the aim was not that good, a few of them might die, but a lot of them wouldn't. Now a lot of people died, so the major part of the wounds that they saw back in the surgical hospitals were extremity wounds. And you figure what a mini ball does, if it hits, it doesn't, if you're lucky, it just goes through soft tissue. Most of them would hit a bone, they would shatter the bone. And trying to take care of this was a dreadful undertaking, because what they very quickly figured out in the Union Army was if you did an amputation, first of all, they couldn't try to save this. It would be automatically infected. Everything was driven into the wound. You have bacteria and all sorts of debris inside the bone. So they would look at this saying that there was no way they can do this. And they would decide on amputation, and the rules were, they knew that if they did an amputation within the first 24 hours, the mortality was 25%. If they waited another 24 hours, it was 50%, and it goes up from there. So amputations were done immediately, virtually immediately, right as soon as they could get a hold of them. Most of the extremity wounds were terrible wounds which had shattered bone, and they would have to go and do this. They said it wasn't as bad as you hear about with all of the circumstances with this, with no anesthetic, because they now have ether and chloroform. Chloroform is far more popular than ether because ether is way too flammable and you're around black powder. So in this instance, they would probably been using more chloroform. And some of the people are writing saying, oh, this story about people having to have surgery without anesthetic is all wrong. No, they ran out, unfortunately. Both sides, especially in the South, would have run out on doing this. When the war began, the Federal Army had a total of 87 medical officers. They had 100 and some odd, but a group of them left to become the part of the Confederacy. And the Confederates only had the 24, which had been part of the Union Army. By 1865, this was up from 87. This goes up to 13,000 Union doctors. And any number of volunteers that also listed there. We don't quite know the numbers in the South because the records were not as complete on this. Of the approximately 620,000 men that were killed, In the 4-year conflict, that was 360,000 in the north and 260,000 in the south. Figure that tops the total fatalities of any other war that we have fought. Approximately 10,000 Union and 94,000 Confederates died of wounds received in battle, and the others died of disease. And that means we're now about a 1/3, 2/3. 2/3 of them die here. This is still a significant advance. At the time of the Mexican-American War, 90% of the casualties are from disease. And at the time of the Revolutionary War, it was that 90%. Also, the fatality rate for what I was telling you before was at the time of the Revolutionary War, fatality rate from, or mortality rate from amputations was roughly 65%. We're now down to 25% if they get them in time. Half of the deaths from disease during the Civil War were caused by intestinal disorders, mostly typhoid, diarrhea, and dysentery. The remainder died from pneumonia and tuberculosis, and they were also plagued. And you have to understand what these soldiers were. These are kids from farms. They had virtually no exposure to large groups of people, and any kind of contagious disease just went rampant through the camps, even though they were trying to get better understanding. The cleanliness habits that really started during the Civil War, we still use in large extent when we're dealing with troops today. They hadn't been exposed to the large variety of common diseases like measles, chickenpox, mumps, and whooping cough. Typhoid was even more devastating. Perhaps 1/4 of the non-combatant deaths in the Confederacy were from typhoid. Although treatment with quinine reduced fatalities, malaria nevertheless struck 1/4 of all servicemen. Malaria was endemic in the San Pedro Valley until the 1930s. It's that late that we have it in there. Another description was what happens when they're taking these, when they're doing surgery. Everything about the operation was septic. The surgeon operated in a blood and often pus-stained coat. He might hold his lancet in his mouth. If he dropped an instrument or a sponge, he picked it up, rinsed it in cold water if he had any water, and continued work. When loose pieces of bone or tissue had been removed, the wound would be packed with moist lint or cotton. Unsterilized bandages were wet. Unsterilized bandages, the bandages were kept wet. Patient tried to keep as quiet as possible by quinine, and I don't know what quinine would, and whiskey. And that was the supportive regimen that they would try to do with this. It is surprising that anyone was able to manage in this, but they were able to do it. And there is, I should talk about two other instances. One is that the commander, the military surgeon in the South, was Samuel Preston Moore, who was an absolute martinet. He demanded that people pass an exam before he would let them be a surgeon. This is when the South was desperate for them, but he demanded that he did that. He also was one of the best procurers. There was no sergeant in Korea that was any better at procuring and stealing from everybody than Samuel Preston Moore was. He got everything he could get, and he kept them going actually fairly well, served till the end of the war. As contrast, William Hammond, who was the one who was appointed in the North, very bright, very brilliant man who realized that antisepsis was one of the things and cleanliness was one of the things that needed to be done, and tried to force this on them. And the other thing he did was he banned the use of mercurials. And for that, he got himself court-martialed and thrown out, because everyone used mercurials because that was our best treatment for all sorts of things. Post-Civil War, in Arizona, many or most of the people, as I said, actually were military surgeons who stayed, and the same idea of demanding some kind of reasonable care actually occurred pretty much about this time also. Just individuals. There was one in Phoenix, whose name I'm blanking on now, who demanded that everyone trying to practice in Phoenix come and present his degree before him. And the guy was such a bully that he made it work. Equally, John Handy in Tucson, who was an absolute bully, and you've heard about John Handy and his duel, or rather the fight with that man, demanded that anyone who wanted to practice in Tucson had to present his degree before Dr. Handy, and he could only practice if Dr. Handy agreed that he was a doctor. Now, no one appointed him to do this. He just did it on his own. So there was really no, in most instances though, there was nothing that prevented anyone from practicing if they'd hang out a degree and call themselves a doctor. We had some bright lights. We had Walter Reed, who practiced, I think, in Tucson at Fort Lowell. We had George Goodfellow, who was at Fort Whipple and Fort Lowell. Basically, Arizona's population then, we started to get some really good people. We're now at a point where there is a much greater understanding of medicine in major advances. As they said, the terror of childbirth was removed by Dr. Gordon of Aberdeen, Dr. Semmelweis, who at least tried to get it done in Vienna, and also Oliver Wendell Holmes, who I didn't know was one of the foremost people. All they were doing, they didn't understand why, but all they were doing is say, clean your hands. And it worked on doing this. Of course, this is the time when we get the germ theory fully understood, and we get Pasteur and all of his predecessors. Incidentally, germ theory is not brand new with Pasteur. It's a lot older than that was there. In 1880, Arizona was being promoted as an herbal mecca, and that is not an herbal, excuse me, as a health mecca. And the reason for that is that the feeling was that Arizona was very salutary to health. Reports kept going back to the east, and of course the Arizona politicians were promoting it enormously, that this is a place where you get rid of your TB, you get rid of your arthritis, you get rid of all the ailments that you had, and you can come to Arizona, you throw your crutches away. And we still get people saying that, that, you know, come here and you get rid of your asthma, come here you get rid of your arthritis. So it was being promoted as the thing that was fortunate that we could actually do this. However, by 1890, there began to be concern on the part of the physicians in Arizona about the quality, and that led to the formation of the Arizona Medical Association in 1892. And in 1897, registration was passed by the state. You had to register as a doctor. They didn't say what you did with it, but you had to register, and it cost you $2. And they licensed MDs and DOs, homeopathic and eclectic physicians. And I hadn't heard of eclectic physicians, but by George, they existed until 1939. And it's sort of like homeopathy, only they're using more of the herbal remedies without the tiniest amounts being there. In 1897, as I said, it cost that amount, and the Board of Medical Examiners started in about 1903. And from then on, you had to pass an examination. And if I'd had the time to do this properly, I'm sorry about this, I would have passed out the examination and used that as your examination to see. Because I guarantee you, none of us would pass the 1902 medical examination. It is that hard to, it's things that we no longer see, no longer believe, and it's a lot more universal than we would look at today. You may be wondering why, in final analysis, why I have the buffalo skull here. The buffalo skull is sacred to the Plains Indians, of course. And what I'll tell you about this was given to me by a wonderful lady who was an American Indian nun, Seneca, a tribal elder, who was my patient. We are blessed at sometimes to be able to take care of saints, and she was. Anyway, she gave this to me, said, "You're a son of the American Revolution, you need this." And I said, "Okay." But what it has on there is the sacred hoop, which is represented as the moon on the outside, the sun on the inside. The sacred hoop is the circle of life and death and rebirth. And the Plains Indians fully understood this. I had no realization how old this was until I was listening to a program on Clovis culture and the earliest humans in this area. At the time of the Ice Age, no Ice Age, we weren't down this far. Of course, we didn't have any ice in this area or anywhere around, but the tundra was several hundred miles, permafrost, several hundred miles past the ice shelf. And virtually all of the large prey animals that were used by Paleolithic man or were hunted by Paleolithic man died. And the only one that didn't die was the buffalo. And the reason the Plains Indians, I think, revere the buffalo so much is this was the source of all life for them, because without that, they would have starved without the buffalo. So give you an idea of how ancient medicine is in this area. This is hopefully something to give you at least a start on where it is. In answer to the questions, I think you've got most of them. The other thing is simply to realize that people still carry these beliefs. And if you are sensitive to the culture around you and realize that the beliefs are part of what they will be doing, it might explain some things. Margarita Kay talked about that, said that the lady has her recurrent diabetic ulcer, and she treats it with a mashed product made of agave and aloe. She puts this poultice on, and she says it'll cure it. It always gets better when it does. Her doctor, of course, would have been horrified that she was putting this on there, but hey, works for her. If you're aware that your patients may be doing some of these things of the cross-cultural background, how ancient it is, it sort of broadens the interest of what you can do. Thank you very much. And I am sure that there are people in this assemblage who know a great deal more about all of this than I do. So please feel free to correct me on this. What I ought to have said also is, this is lecture number 1 of 12. We'll keep going on this until we got it right. Any questions? Or comments? Thank you.
Thank you, Rudy. You're welcome to come up after the cake to examine the amputation saw and even try it, I guess.
Absolutely.
And the, what's it called, the scarificator?
Well, actually, this is a phleem. This is what you would use when you were drawing blood or when you're for bloodletting, and this is about the amount that you would take, roughly a pint, and you do that over and over until the person declared themselves to be well. Or dead, you know, whichever. Benjamin Rush, signer of the Declaration, said, if you are, it's quite allowable to remove 4/5 of the blood of the human body. Of course, he always also thought that we had another quart that we don't have, so he was removing 7/8. But you know, if the person died, he died. He'd done his best.
He was a psychiatrist, right?
Yes.
And the founder of the University of Pennsylvania Medical School.
Yes.
Go ahead. What about the cake? Okay, here comes the cake. Not the bride, but the cake. And if you want to bring it up here so Dr. Wilson can do the ceremonial cut?
We will make a place for him.
Right here. You know, Dr. Wilson, he's my friend, so I can say that he was he's so old that he was in Arizona at the time of statehood. Dr. Phibbs was going to come, but the weather kept him away because he called a few days ago. We are going to have Dr. Phibbs and Dr. Wilson here. They are our two most senior physicians do the cutting, but Dr. Wilson, you're all by yourself. Where's the knife?
John, what's your medical license number?
001.
No, what?
115 or some darn thing. It's long since I got it. Go.
Let me get this out of your way then. Yeah, that's okay.
Sorry to.
Oh, that's okay.
Okay, this is for the centennial of Arizona statehood and Valentine's Day. What does it say?
That's a big cut.
The cake says happy birthday. Well, Arizona. It'll be ready for distribution in about 1 minute.